Hello, everyone. It is time to get started. Hi, also everyone online. Good to have you with us. We want to talk about identifying and recognizing your most valuable contributors. And I'll mostly focus on the identifying part today. When we think about community, and we're in open source, we're all about communities here. The core thing about communities is that people self-select to be part of these communities, especially when we have volunteer communities. I know there's a larger growing part of corporate open source where whether everyone is really volunteer or not is a question, but they're still somehow self-selecting to be in these communities. And when you hear a phrase like, we released a new version and it was like magic. I don't know how we did it. It speaks to the fact that it's on one hand an engineering miracle, engineering magic, but on the other hand, it's about the people. There are so many people involved who are doing things that we are unaware of, or we don't know what's actually going on there. So today I want to really talk about identifying these people that are making this magic happen, and how do we recognize them? I'm Georg. I did my PhD on open source, on corporate open source and metrics, and I co-founded the Chaos Project, which I'll talk about at the end. It's community health analytics open source software, where we talk about community health and metrics and analytics. I'm also the lead of the community advisory group at IEEE SA Open, and I'm the director of sales at Bitergia. And Bitergia does metrics for open source. The structure for today's talk is to think about the community of contributors. We'll go a little bit basic, recap what we know and how to think about communities so that we can start to get at the right metrics and analytics, which is the second part of this talk. And then we'll recap with what can we do to recognize contributors? I come at this from an angle of open source project health. And I define this as the potential to continue developing quality software. We are thinking a lot about what makes a community sustainable, what makes a project sustainable, and it comes back down to people. It always comes back down to people. If we don't have a healthy community, if we don't have the people doing things, then the technology will decay and get old and not be updated. So we need to really focus on the community, on the people and who they are. So how should we think about communities? What is the angle here? There's a theory about the onion model that I find helpful for thinking about all the different layers in a community. We have contributors at each of these different layers that are doing various things around the community. So we'll walk through each layer here in a bit and think about who are these people, what are they contributing. The important thing is that all of them are important. And while this is an interesting framework to think about the community, people are in all layers and the same person can be part of multiple layers as well. So it's not saying, hey, this person is a lurker or user or casual contributor or core contributor. It's not about that. We're using this model purely to think about what all is in the community so that we are not missing anyone. So let's start at the core of this onion model, at the core contributors. When we think about who is at the center of things, the first term that usually comes to mind is the maintainer in an open source project. These are the people who take on leadership roles, who steward the technology, but also the community. They're making strategic decisions about where do we want to go. And board members or coordinators, depending on the governance of an open source project, you have different names there. And they're the most active members. They're the most visible. They're the ones going to conferences and speaking about the open source project. So they're pretty easy to identify, especially when they follow good practices and put their names on the README so you can know who is in charge. Going a little bit out, we have more casual contributors. These are people who inconsistently contribute. They sometimes come, maybe they have a question, maybe they have a specific bug that they experience. Sometimes they might come with a code change, a pull request, and want to help out in a small way. They're typically focused on something that they really care about, not so much worrying about the community and the strategy. That's what the core people are for. And we can find these, because they show up in issue trackers, in comments, they show up in various communication channels. Now, as we move out, I like to think of the users as well. They are important. They are dependent on what the community is doing. They're key stakeholders. The big challenge here, they may never introduce themselves. I've spoken with many maintainers who say, I would love to know who is actually using our software. But unless there is something broken, we break an API, no one ever tells us, hey, we're using your software. So that's a big challenge. We know the users are the largest group. Some open source projects may only have one maintainer, a few casual contributors, but then millions of users because it's embedded in the Linux kernel or shipped with every distribution. So we need to think about the users as well. Unfortunately, I don't have a really good way of identifying all of them. If I could solve that problem, I think I would be rich. And then we have the lurkers. These are people who fulfill a critical role in translating. They stay up to date on what is happening in the community. They are subscribing to mailing lists and then taking that knowledge and doing something with it that is also not visible to us. They might be in a company driving decisions around should we use an open source project or not. They might be communicating with with their circles about what they're learning in open source. So we need to think about who are these boundary spanners that are maybe in other communities. They're interested in our module and our library that we are maintaining, but it's being used in another open source project. And so they're lurking, staying up to date on what is happening as well. All of these people are doing a variety of many different things. And I put a lot of words on here that this comes from a chaos metric where we thought about what are all the ways that people contribute to an open source community. It's not so important what those individual items are, so I'm not going in detail. But once we start to think about, okay, it's more than just writing code. We acknowledge that we need people who are participating in bug triaging or writing documentation or organizing events or public relations, being active on social media, helping with questions. We start to see a larger and larger community. So if you want to identify who these people are, we need to have that picture of where is our community. That's why we just looked at all of these different layers and think about what are the channels that our community is using. Obvious ones are our version control system, usually Git. We have issue trackers, change requests on GitLab, that's merge requests, on GitHub, that's pull requests. We have mailing lists, we have chat like Slack or Mattermost or Rocket Chat, Stack Overflow for questions and answers, wikis, documentation, and more. One thing here to think about when we talk about our communities is how can we get the people who are doing things that are not showing up yet to actually participate in the channels that we can track. So in some communities, it's common to open an issue for organizing events, or somehow bringing these interactions into a platform that we can observe. And the next part, now that we understand our community, is about how do we actually get to these metrics and analytics. And I come from this, again, from an angle of understanding project health and embedding knowledge about project health and how do we understand communities in metrics is what I'm working on. So metrics is a way of measuring something, but it's also the outcome of that measurement. And in open source, we have community data that we want to transform into insights. And that's what we use those metrics for. So in these communication channels that we just identified, we have what is called trace data. People don't go there to say, hey, please, here's some data for your metrics about how your community do it. People are in these channels collaborating, working together because they want to get something done. They want to create something, they want to work together. And the trace data is incidentally left there for us to analyze. So we need to be mindful about this, that as we have this data, people may not have provided with the intention that we analyze it. So I need to do a little excursion here on the legal challenges of that. So because it contains like names and email addresses and sometimes who they worked for. So I'll try to keep this really short and lighthearted. To focus on, I have two excursions. So this is the first one on legal challenges. I'll just focus on the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. It's the European framework around data privacy and protection. And it's one of the most comprehensive that others are modeled after. So if we just understand GDPR, we probably covered most of our bases already. The key thing here, as we are talking about identifying people, is to understand what their rights are. And GDPR says that people, the data subjects, our people, our community members have the right to know what is happening to their data. We have to be transparent about the way that we use the data, and they need to have, they have some rights about being forgotten, that we remove their data, that if they say, please don't analyze the data that I'm involved in, we have to remove that. So that is something we need to think about. In the Chaos project, we created a data policy where on our website, in our community repo, which we just heard in the previous talk is important, we say here, you are participating in the community, you are leaving data behind, we have a community dashboard, you can go look at what we have, and we are very transparent about it. GDPR was created for corporations. It was not created for open source. And so there is some gray area. And we need to think about what does that actually mean for us? Because, you know, the people are contributing to open source to get work done. And we've established it that we like to know who's contributing, so we know whether we can trust certain contributions or not. It's not, we don't allow anonymous contributions usually. And so, yes, the data is public and it was provided willingly, but GDPR still applies. So we need to weigh, is the interest of analyzing the data outweighing the interest of the individual person? And there are two ways to consider consent here. One is opt-in. That means we ask every open source contributor in our projects, are you okay with us analyzing your data? Not practical. So we need to go with opt-out, where we demonstrate that it is in the best interest of the community to analyze this data. And we can do this by saying, hey, we are understanding the community, so we can help it, we can manage it, we can identify where we have areas to improve, where things are lacking. And then we can make the case to say, okay, it is in the good interest that we have this, and everything we just talked about with being transparent and open and letting everyone know, hey, this is happening, should be good. So we inform the community members, we obtain consent through opt-out, and it comes down to just being, being honest, transparent about here, this is what we are doing with the data. Okay, done with excursion on legal requirements. Now, technical challenges. We already talked about, we want to have data from the community. What do we actually, how do we get the data, and how do we make good use of it to find those people that are really key in our communities? So one thing is identify where they are. What are the data sources we need to collect data from? And then we get the data. It comes in a raw format that we need to then work with, enrich it, and make useful. The raw data is the easy step. That is where we have an API call, we have a log somewhere, an archive, pull in the data. The challenging thing is if APIs change or the data formats change. The more challenging part is enriching the data. We need to, especially coming from many different data sources, they all like different date formats. God forbid someone puts a day before the month or the other way around. So we need to standardize this, put it into a data model where we can analyze it and make sense of it. Another challenge is identities, especially when we want to work with people. They use different usernames on different platforms or different email addresses. So being able to combine those different identities, say, hey, this is the same person, is something that our tooling should provide, unless you want to do it manually. But it's really nice to be able to say, hey, all of these contributions across Slack and GitHub and mailing lists is coming from the same person. There is a ethical challenge here. If someone has a work account and a personal account, they don't want work to know what they do privately. So just as a side note, we have then also to calculate metrics. The APIs and the logs give us like when was something done, but not how long was the time between opening and closing an issue, or how much time until a maintainer responded to an issue. So there are some calculations that we want to do. And the final step is to make the data useful. So we need to understand what are we using the data for, who is looking at it, how can we best present it? And that is the last part where we talk about how do we identify the important contributors. One last note on this excursion is the technical solutions. So I just raised a lot of challenges, and there are open source projects that have solved many of these. And you can go, Chaos has Grimoire Lab and Augur. Those are tools you can go and use. Cauldron, you can just go to the Cauldron.io website and start using it. Apache Kibble, if you're in the Apache software ecosystem, it's already set up for, I think, all of the Apache projects. Great tool. And then the Cloud Native Compute Foundation has Dev Analytics that is focused on their set of projects. So now we have the data. We have solved all of those challenges. Now we can get back to identifying who our most valuable contributors are. And I want to talk about 3 different approaches. One is leaderboards, one is the onion, using the onion model, and the third is network analysis. Leaderboards. We just had a great panel at Open Source Summit about this, And there's a blog post on opensource.com that I recommend you check out as well. The link is down here. Leaderboards are a way of ranking who is at the top. I don't want to say better. I'm going to say at the top. There is some algorithm there. On GitHub, when you go to Insights, you see who is the person with the most commits on this repository. It's great to see, who is really behind a project. That's what this provides. Drupal has a leaderboard for companies who are the most active, engaged companies in the project, and they look at multiple metrics, issues on commits, different things that their employees are doing in the Drupal community. Even in the chaos community, when you go to our community dashboard, on the first page, you see two leaderboards. One is about the top Git authors, and one is about the top or the most active projects at the moment. The way that leaderboards work is we have the community activities that generate the trace data, and then we have some scoring algorithms. We need to have some way to generate a score that determines the ranking on the leaderboard. And now there's a feedback loop. If we use leaderboards as not just a tool to understand the community, but we actually take the leaderboard and show it to the community, then people start to see, oh, I'm ranked here. If I do something more of this thing that is being counted, I can increase my ranking. And so we start to have a feedback loop of people changing their behavior based on what we are ranking, what is going into our scoring algorithm. So I'm mentioning this because leaderboards are a great way to see who is at the top, who is the most active in certain areas. But if we use the leaderboards in a way to incentivize community members or to reward them, then we will have that aspect of gamification. So we need to have that taken into account. Yes, you want to add something?
Yeah, so my day job is tracking the reports under the hood. Send it to leaders.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So for everyone online, I'm going to repeat real quick or summarize. Stephen is a university professor and shared that leaderboards can de-incentivize newcomers because they start at the bottom and they're like, oh, I'm never going to make it up there. So a solution that he proposed is to have like weekly leaderboards or monthly leaderboards where you always have the chance of landing on it at a higher spot again. And also in open source communities, we just talked about how there are many different areas where people are contributing. So having one leaderboard for the whole community is probably not the way to go. You might want to have one for the translation team. You might want to have one for the event organizers. You might want to have one for a certain module, not even the whole commit log, so that everyone gets recognized with their peers that they're working with most closely, and you provide some context. I mentioned leaderboards because it helps us find the people who are most active. Whether to actually use the leaderboard to show it on our website or whatnot, that's a different story. So we can use it without actually showing the leaderboards because it has the danger of alienating contributors. Another thing, I'm just going to mention this real quick, is when we have the leaderboard and people are more concerned about their ranking then with the community, then it changes the dynamics in the community. And it becomes more about doing those certain activities, even if it becomes detrimental to the culture in the community. So just a warning here. They're still useful. Leaderboards are still useful. Just be careful. Moving on, the onion model. We just used the onion model to think about what is happening in a community and to not just focus on the core, but to think bigger. And we can use this also to understand different types of contributors by their level of engagement. I'm going to use a slightly different model here where we think about core contributors, regular contributors, and casual contributors. And in Grimoire Lab, the software that I'm using this from, it's based on the number of contributions. So if we take all the contributors and how much they've contributed, the top 80% of contributions are the people who we consider as core contributors. The next 15 most active are the regular, and then the casual is the long tail of contributors who contributed with very few contributions. And in the chaos community, it looks like this. We have over time fluctuating how many casual or even regular contributors we count, but the number of core contributors stays somewhat consistent. And in the numbers here on the bottom left, you can see the group of core contributors, even though they make up 80% of the contributions, is the smallest number of contributors. So the Pareto principle here definitely applies, where we can now use this to identify, okay, who is actually in this group of core contributors? And we can use this to filter our list of contributors and see, okay, who is consistently engaged, who is in these concentric circles in our onion model, at the center, at the core, or regular, or who shows up regularly as a casual. We can even ask that question. So that is using the onion model to understand who is contributing. And now network analysis, the third method that I wanted to share with you. Network analysis helps us identify boundary spanners. It helps us identify relationships that are not obvious from just looking at the raw numbers, but when we think of communities as more spatial places where we have people moving between different communities, moving between different repositories, between different projects, and they transfer knowledge. This is necessary to coordinate. In the Chaos project, I show up in a lot of repositories because I do some of the administrative stuff. And so you would guess that if you find me at that intersection in the middle, maybe if you talk to me, you understand a little bit more about what's happening in all of these areas. So these are great people to identify. And the way we arrive at the network is we think of contributors as nodes, or we plot them out as dots. We decide on other types of nodes, like at the project level or repository level, or even communication channels. And we can make those rectangles, and then we draw lines between them. And by doing this, with multiple projects, multiple communication channels, we can start to think bigger pictures, look at ecosystems. So if we look at an example from the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, we have Kubernetes and then a lot of projects around it. This is a little bit older already. They have definitely grown a lot since, but we can see where are the people that are coordinating, who is managing interdependencies, because they have dependencies. They rely on each other as projects. So who is managing that? Who is helping make sure that we can, as we upgrade with the next version, who can help with that? the Mozilla Foundation also looked at the network of projects that they have and the contributors. And I encourage you to check out the report at report.mozilla.community with a nice interactive map of the different projects and how people are engaged across the larger community. So these are some things that you can do with the network analysis. Now we have talked about identifying who our people are that are most active or in really critical places in our communities. How do we recognize them? Well, there are many ways, and we have done many of these already. And so this is more of a recap. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. Simple thing to do is say thank you. Once you know who is active, who is doing critical things, say thank you. Have a public shout out. Okay, in some cultures, people might be uncomfortable with that public attention. So you want to check in with your contributor if they would be okay with that. In other cultures, it's perfectly awesome to get public recognition that way. Badging is one way to recognize them. Have some kind of symbol or token that they can display on their profile or in whatever platform you use. Leaderboards, we already talked about that. I'm not going to repeat myself. Funding, send them to a conference, let them take part in some activities if they need funding for that. Give them permissions or leadership roles in your community. That's also a way that you can recognize, hey, I've seen you've done a lot in the forum. Do you want to be a moderator? Invitations to participate in events, give them speaking opportunities, share what they are doing with the community. It's both beneficial for both the community because they are speaking about it and for themselves, building out their brand as someone who knows what's going on. They can establish themselves as experts. If you are hiring, you can hire from the community. Swag, send them little thank you boxes. So there are many different things that once we know who are the people who are making the magic, so to speak, happen, that we can make them feel loved and welcomed and included. Now I'm gonna take you on a little, I'm gonna invite you, I'm gonna extend an invitation that if you want to talk more about how do we understand communities and the health of communities and the people, I invite you to join the conversation in CHAOS, the Community Health Analytics open source software project, which is a Linux Foundation project. Bitergia co-founded it back in 2017. And we came together as open source ecosystem to talk about what is community health, what is project health, how do we understand it through analytics and metrics. And one thing we narrowed down or identified really fast is we cannot just look at statistics and metrics. We need to understand what our goals are for the community. And we have questions for how we reach those goals, or are we on the right track? And then we can identify what metrics are most insightful to let us know if we are on the right path or no, we need to change something, our strategy is not working. In the CHAOS project, if you want to join the conversation around metrics specifically, we have 5 working groups that have different specializations. One is common metrics, like who, what, when, where, diversity and inclusion, evolution, like how a project is doing overall, risk that a project can have for users, for contributors, and also value. What's the value of communities? What are the metrics we can use there? And yeah, we talk about best practices, like using the goal, question, metric approach, using the metrics to tell stories. It's not about showing a nice, pretty graph that goes up in one direction. That's nice to look at, but we want to understand the community. And so we can use the metrics to back up a story that we are telling and make sure we're telling the right story and not something we made up. We want to also think about gamification, making sure people that the metrics we are showing, people will behave according to that. But no matter where you are, if you don't have metrics, start small, get off zero. If you already have something, then there's always a little bit to improve from there. That is all I wanted to share with you today. We've covered about communities of contributors and how we can think about communities to make sure we don't leave anyone out in our considerations. We've talked about the metrics and analytics that can help us identify who our most valuable contributors are and ways that we can recognize those contributors. And as a little Easter egg, I gave you a place where we can continue this conversation later. With that, I'm done. Feel free to connect with me. I'm happy to answer questions or have a conversation with you now or after we close the session. Yes, Jonas. I'm sorry, it's really hard to understand.
Oh, sorry.
So the question was, as Bitergia is tracking and analyzing a lot of open source communities for our customers, whether we have seen a dip in contributions. And yes, we have in some cases, and we have seen upticks in others. So it depends on the community. Also, people being at home, not having to commute, they were able to do more and had to do more on platforms. So there are stories to be told about working more in the open now or more on platforms, but there's also the story of, oh, I'm just done. I don't want to deal with it. And we've seen those dips as well. We have a blog post, I think, on 2-3 communities that I can send you if you're interested. Yeah. And the thing is, you need to understand the communities to know why there are dips and ups. It could be COVID. It could also be they had turnover. The company was sold. There are many reasons why people start to contribute more or less. What other thoughts do you have that might be interesting to share? I briefly mentioned badging. If you're interested in badging, we have a community effort at IEEE SA Open where we are thinking about how do we do badging for projects, for individuals, and what are the kinds of badges that can do multiple things. One is reward contributors for doing the right things and being active, but also how do we recognize and acknowledge projects that have good practices, that have the right documentation, that are following the standards that we set for what a good project should look like. And then the reverse is of badges that you can now see as someone coming to a project. Okay, they've already taken care of this. I don't have to go look through all of their repositories, all of their documentation, how they are doing things. The badge is a signal that as we are thinking through this, hopefully in the future, we can simplify a little bit how we work with open source projects. The CII best practices badge is an example for that, where they have thought about what are best practices for security in open source projects. And open source projects that get this best practices badge and show it, now you have some reassurance that they've gone through and thought about how do we make sure that the lights don't go off. All right. Last call. What else is interesting to you all? And we got encouraged yesterday to use you all or y'all more often. All y'all. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining me, having this conversation. Thank you online, everyone who joined on the platform and tuned in. That's it.